History of the Prophet Joseph, Chapter 1. Solomon Mack, the father of Lucy Mack, extract from his narrative. My father, Solomon Mack, was born in the town of Lyme, New London County, state of Connecticut, September 26, 1735. His father, Ebenezer Mack, was a man of considerable property and lived in good style, commanding all the attention and respect which are ever shown to those who live in fine circumstances and habits of strict morality. For a length of time he fully enjoyed the fruits of his industry, but this state of things did not always continue, for a series of misfortunes visited my grandparents, by which they were reduced to that extremity that a once happy and flourishing family were compelled to disperse and throw themselves upon the charity of a cold, unfeeling world. My father was taken into the family of a neighboring farmer, where he remained until he was 21 years of age, about which time he enlisted in the service of his country. I have a sketch of my father's life written by himself, in which is detailed an account of his several campaigns and many of his adventures while in the army. From this I extract the following. At the age of 21 years I left my master, shortly after which I enlisted in the service of my country under the command of Captain Henry, and was annexed to the regiment commanded by Colonel Whiting. From Connecticut we marched to Fort Edwards in the state of New York. We were in a severe battle fought at Halfway Brook in 1855. During this expedition I caught a heavy cold, which rendered me unfit for business until the return of warm weather. I was carried the ensuing spring to Albany. In the year 1757, I had 2 teams in the king's service, which was employed in carrying the general's baggage. While thus engaged, I went one morning to yoke my team, but 3 of my oxen were missing. When this knowledge came to the officer, he was very angry, and drawing his sword, threatened to run it through me. He then ordered me to get 3 other oxen, which I accordingly did, and proceeded with the baggage to Fort Edwards, and the next day I returned in order to find my missing oxen. While I was performing this trip, the following circumstances occurred. About halfway from Stillwater to Fort Edwards, I espied 4 Indians, nearly 30 rods distant, coming out of the woods. They were armed with scalping knives, tomahawks, and guns. I was alone, but about 20 rods behind me was a man by the name of Webster. I saw my danger, and that there was no way to escape unless I could do it by stratagem. So I rushed upon them, calling in the meantime at the top of my voice, "Rush on! Rush on, my boys! We'll have the devils!" The only weapon I had was a walking staff. Yet I ran toward them, and as the other man appeared just at that instant, it gave them a terrible fright, and I saw no more of them. I hastened to Stillwater the next day, as aforementioned, and finding my oxen soon after I arrived there, I returned the same night to Fort Edwards, a distance of 7 miles, the whole of which was a dense forest. In 1758, I enlisted under Major Spencer, and went immediately over Lake George with a company who crossed in boats to the western side, where we had a bloody and hot engagement with the enemy, in which Lord Howe fell at the onset of the battle. His bowels were taken out and buried, but his body was embalmed and carried to England. The next day we marched to the breastworks, but were unsuccessful, being compelled to retreat with a loss of 500 men killed and as many more wounded. In this contest I narrowly escaped. A musket ball passed under my chin within half an inch of my neck. The army then returned to Lake George, and on its way thither a large scouting party of the enemy came round by Skenesborough, and at Halfway Brook destroyed a large number of both men and teams. Upon this, 1,000 of our men were detached to repair immediately to Skenesborough in pursuit of them, but when we arrived at South Bay, the enemy were entirely out of our reach. The enemy then marched to Ticonderoga, New York, in order to procure supplies, after which they immediately pursued us, but we eluded them by hastening to Wood Creek, and thence to Fort Anne, where we arrived on the 13th day of the month. We had just reached this place when the sentry gave information that the enemy was all around us, in consequence of which we were suddenly called to arms. Major Putnam led the company, and Major Rogers brought up the rear. We marched but 3/4 of a mile when we came suddenly upon a company of Indians that were lying in ambush. Major Putnam marched his men through their ranks, whereupon the Indians fired, which threw our men into some confusion. Major Putnam was captured by them, and would have been killed by an Indian had he not been rescued by a French lieutenant. The enemy rose like a cloud and fired a whole volley upon us, and as I was in the foremost rank, the retreat of my company brought me in the rear, and the tomahawks and bullets flew around me like hailstones. As I was running, I saw not far before me a windfall, which was so high that it appeared to me insurmountable. However, by making great exertions, I succeeded in getting over it. Running a little farther, I observed a man who had, in this last conflict, been badly wounded, and the Indians were close upon him. Nevertheless, I turned aside for the purpose of assisting him, and succeeded in getting him into the midst of our army, in safety. In this encounter, a man named Gershom Bowley had 9 bullets shot through his clothes, but received no personal injury. Ensign Worcester received 9 wounds, was scalped and tomahawked, notwithstanding which he lived and finally recovered. The above engagement commenced early in the morning and continued until about 3 o'clock p.m., in which half of our men were either killed, wounded, or taken prisoners. In consequence of this tremendous slaughter, we were compelled to send to Fort Edwards for men, in order to assist in carrying our wounded, which were about 80 in number. The distance we had to carry them was nearly 14 miles. To carry so many thus far was truly very fatiguing, insomuch that when we arrived at the place of destination, my strength was about exhausted. I proceeded immediately to Albany for the purpose of getting supplies, and returned again to the army as soon as circumstances would admit. Autumn having now arrived, I went home, where I tarried the ensuing winter. In the spring of 1759, the army marched to Crown Point, where I received my discharge. In the same year I became acquainted with an accomplished young woman, a schoolteacher, by the name of Lydia Gates. She was the daughter of Nathan Gates, who was a man of wealth, living in the town of East Haddam, Connecticut. To this young woman I was married shortly after becoming acquainted with her. Having received a large amount of money for my services in the army, and deeming it prudent to make an investment of the same in real estate, I contracted for the whole town of Granville, in the state of New York. On the execution of the deed, I paid all the money that was required in the stipulation, which stipulation also called for the building of a number of log houses. I accordingly went to work to fulfill this part of the contract, but after laboring a short time, I had the misfortune to cut my leg, which subjected me during that season to the care of a physician. I hired a man to do the work and paid him in advance in order to fulfill my part of the contract, but he ran away with the money without performing the labor, and the consequence was I lost the land altogether. In 1761, we moved to the town of Marlow, where we remained until we had 4 children. When we moved there, it was no other than a desolate and dreary wilderness. Only 4 families resided within 40 miles. Here I was thrown into a situation to appreciate more fully the talents and virtues of my excellent wife, for as our children were deprived of schools, she assumed the charge of their education, and performed the duties of an instructress as none save a mother is capable of. Precepts accompanied with examples, such as hers, were calculated to make impressions on the minds of the young, never to be forgotten. She, besides instructing them in the various branches of an ordinary education, was in the habit of calling them together both morning and evening, and teaching them to pray, meanwhile urging upon them the necessity of love toward each other, as well as devotional feelings towards Him who made them. In this manner my first children became confirmed in habits of piety, gentleness, and reflection, which afforded great assistance in guiding those who came after them into the same happy channel. The education of my children would have been a more difficult task if they had not inherited much of their mother's excellent disposition. In 1776, I enlisted in the service of my country, and was for a considerable length of time in the land forces, after which I went with my two sons, Jason and Stephen, on a privateering expedition, commanded by Captain Havens. Soon after we set sail we were driven upon Horseneck. We succeeded, however, in getting some of our guns on shore, and bringing them to bear upon the enemy, so as to exchange many shots with them. Yet they cut away our rigging and left our vessel much shattered. We then hauled off and cast anchor, but in a short time we espied 2 row galleys, 2 sloops, and 2 schooners. We quickly weighed anchor and hauled to shore again, and had barely time to post 4 cannon in a position in which they could be used, before a sanguinary contest commenced. The balls from the enemy's guns tore up the ground, cutting asunder the saplings in every direction. One of the row galleys went round a point of land with the view of hemming us in, but we killed 40 of their men with our small arms, which caused the enemy to abandon their purpose. My son Stephen, in company with the cabin boys, was sent to a house not far from the shore with a wounded man. Just as they entered the house, an 18-pounder followed them. A woman was engaged in frying cakes at the time, and being somewhat alarmed, she concluded to retire into the cellar, saying, as she left, that the boys might have the cakes, as she was going below. The boys were highly delighted at this, and they went to work cooking and feasting upon the lady's sweet cakes, while the artillery of the contending armies was thundering in their ears, dealing out death and destruction on every hand. At the head of this party of boys was Stephen Mack, my second son, a bold and fearless stripling of 14. In this contest, the enemy was far superior to us in point of numbers, yet we maintained our ground with such valor that they thought it better to leave us, and accordingly did so. Soon after this we hoisted sail and made for New London. When hostilities ceased, and peace and tranquillity were again restored, we freighted a vessel for Liverpool, selling both ship and cargo in this place. We embarked on board Captain Foster's vessel, which I afterwards purchased, but in consequence of storms and wrecks, I was compelled to sell her, and was left completely destitute. I struggled a little longer to obtain property, in making adventures, then returned to my family, after an absence of 4 years, about penniless. After this I determined to follow phantoms no longer, but devote the rest of my life to the service of God and my family. I shall now lay aside my father's journal, as I have made such extracts as are adapted to my purpose, and take up the history of his children.